It is great to be back here again. I was talking with someone, I don't remember who exactly, about what I would be teaching on, saying that I'm going to continue some of the lessons that we've been skipping when we only study them in the mornings for the life of Christ, because this is the really important stuff. Well, everything in the life of Christ is the really important stuff, but this is the stuff that we know of, that we've studied, but it's still just good to go over it again. And I think this part is very critical to look at, to understand everything that Jesus went through and what he truly did for each and every one of us. So this morning we studied lesson 110, and tonight we'll continue with 111. If you want to go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 26, that's where we'll be for the majority of things. We'll hop around here and there, but we'll start in Matthew chapter 26. But this is titled, Jesus Prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. So if you think of what goes on in your life, think of your deepest, darkest inner battles. Things that conflict you, things that make you think, that give you struggle, things like that. What was going on when you have those struggles? What's going on in your life? What's going on in the world when you have those kinds of struggles? More importantly, how did you respond to those struggles? And did you overcome those struggles? Did you come out victorious, or did you lose them and learn from them? Or did you just lose them and are still learning or trying to learn from them? But today, with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, we're going to talk about what is going on, a deep, dark time that Jesus is dealing with through the last days while he is getting ready to be crucified and the plan fulfilled. But the writers in the book that we study alongside with this say that this may be and is considered by most to be the greatest battle our Lord had to contend. The wilderness was a battle with the devil, but the garden was a battle with himself. It is also said that no man possesses the verbal skills, spiritual sensitivity, or theological insight to portray this scene in its true context. But we're going to try. No. We're just going to look at what it says Jesus did, the things that he said, who was with him, and just tie it all together and how it shows his love for each and every one of us. So we see a side of Jesus here that was not portrayed very often in the scriptures. We see a side of him that shows the vulnerability of his manhood. We know that Jesus was fully God. We know that Jesus was fully man. But here he shows a little bit more of that vulnerability of his manhood. In Philippians 2, Hebrews 2, and Hebrews 4, when Jesus tells his disciples that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, he wasn't talking about them. He was talking about himself. So in the context, it was Thursday night. That's what the day that we've been studying the last couple weeks has been on. He would soon be betrayed by Jesus. They've already said that He would soon be betrayed by Judas. They've already had the discussion in the upper room that they just left, and he has just finished his prayer that we studied in John chapter 17, and now they were at the Garden of Gethsemane. So in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 30, it says, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So they needed to be sure that Jesus spoke important words to them. But Jesus wasn't giving them long lessons right here. He wasn't giving them long, drawn-out lessons, long messages, things like that. But right here, the gospel writers are more concerned about capturing the events that actually happened, capture them as history more than the words specifically that Jesus would say during these events. So let's start out reading Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. It says, then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." So again, it focuses more on the actions or what's happening around here, and specifically what Jesus is praying to God about and asking him about. So what we're going to discuss in this lesson is discussing the events that happen and how we are to handle things like that may happen in the garden of our lives. So we start with the Garden of Gethsemane, and I hope that's not too small. We kind of start with a general knowledge of it, the location. The traditional spot for Gethsemane is less than a half a mile directly east of the Golden Gate. It was a walled garden, 70 yards squared, which contained 75 or so gnarled olive trees. And on the next slide, I've got it. Again, this is probably even smaller. But just kind of this map that came along with the study was kind of the suggested paths of Jesus' final hours. So you got, nope, I'm hitting the wrong button. I don't use this often enough. You got the Garden of Gethsemane right here. So it's over here. So it's a walled off area. It's a garden. And apparently it has been the location of an oil press used in the harvest of the olive trees. And these olive trees are what gave the Mount of Olives its name. I learned something new when I studied that. So just a little bit of background information there on where it is. But now we're going to look at the garden, an area of conflict. We can look at it as a place of distress. Read with me again, verse 37. It says, "And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed." In the parallel passage, Mark 14 says he began to be very distressed and troubled. And then the following verse in Matthew, in verse 38, says, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." So he was grieved. He was in turmoil. He was in distress. But most likely right here, he's not referring to his upcoming crucifixion. He's talking more about what's going on right now. Everything that has transpired up until this moment is what he's discussing about. It was not only about the agony of Golgotha, but the anguish of Gethsemane that Jesus was referencing here. Keep a finger there in Matthew chapter 26 and turn over to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7 with me. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7 says, "In the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety." So he offered up prayers, but he offered that prayers and supplication with loud crying and tears. Again, Jesus is suffering here. This is not an easy thing for Jesus to be going through, to be handling, as his manhood would show here. It's not an easy task. I don't know if you guys have ever been there. I know that I have, when we've been so stressed about something, so worried about something, that it just brings you to the point of tears because you don't know what the right answer is. The difference here is Jesus did know what the answer was. He knew what the end goal was, what the end result would be, but he was still distressed, and it still was a place for him to express his emotions. Flip over with me to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 and verse 44. Again, just another parallel passage, but it says, "And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground." I believe Jason's talked about this, the actual physical medical things that have to be happening to make somebody sweat drops of blood are so intense that it's nothing that we've ever experienced. But Jesus was going through so much that his sweat drops became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. It's a very vibrant picture that shows us the distress that Jesus was under. Just a little bit of information. Around this time, Passover comes in the early spring, which means that the nights were cool. So Jesus wasn't sweating because it was hot out. Jesus was sweating because he was in distress. There is a medical condition called, I'll try this, hematidrosis or hemihydrosis, which produces these symptoms. However, maybe the emphasis is on the word like, even as blood gushes from a wound, sweat poured from Jesus' face to the earth. And again, just to reiterate, his sweat was not the result of the outward temperature, but it was a result of his inward turmoil. He was going through a lot, and with good cause. So then Jesus prayed for the first time that this cup could pass from him. Jesus went through physical suffering. We know this, but he physically suffered while he was here on earth. He died at an early age of 33, and he endured the physical torture of the cross. He also went through emotional suffering. He was insulted. His own friends deserted him, and he was killed just like a common criminal. But Jesus also went through spiritual suffering. He took it upon himself as guilt. He took upon himself the guilt and the punishment of sin. And, as if that wasn't enough, because he took upon himself that guilt and the punishment of sin, the Father had no choice but to turn his face from him. We talked this morning in our class about the unity that Jesus describes between he and the Father and how we should have that unity. And so that unity is there. It has always been there between him and his Father. And to have it where his Father had to turn his face from him would just be unimaginable with that amount of unity that they had together. The book says some authors wonder why Jesus did not appear to show more courage during this time. But true courage is demonstrated not only by a lack of fear, but by doing what is right when the fear is overwhelming. Though many have faced pain and death, no one else has ever had to face the agony that Jesus did. So he was not showing more courage during this time because he was doing what he knew was right, what he knew that he needed to have done. And he was still going through all of that agony and pain and distress. So when we think about what I first asked you, have we ever been through moments of pain and distress? Jesus has been there. He understands it. So we need to make sure we go to him and ask him for help. So the second point in the garden and area of conflict is it is a place of disappointment. So he took 3 people with him. He took Peter, James, and John. And he asked them, it seemed like a simple request, hey, keep watch. I'm going to go over here and pray. Keep watch for me. But even though Jesus asked them to do this, they had done all these things. They had followed them. Every time he came back, they were asleep. They could not keep watch even an hour. And it really makes us think, they're tired. They've had a lot going on with following Jesus and following him and doing the things that he has asked them to do. But when you're following and serving the Son of God, knowing exactly who he is and being that close to him, and they're still falling asleep, maybe their priorities weren't exactly where they needed to be. And we can make an application to that as well. because we come here on a Sunday to worship God. We come here on Wednesday to study the Bible. And it doesn't matter how long the services run. It's just fantastic to be here with everybody, to be able to study God's Word together, to hear a message from His Word, and to worship God together. So we need to make sure that we have priorities set where they need to be so that we can watch for the Lord, so that we can do the things that He has commanded us to do and to worship Him properly. So the first time He comes back and they're asleep, but it's not the first time, or it's not the only time. So the disappointment just kind of piles on every single time He comes back. But yet He continues, and we read through the rest of that. And then finally, a place of desertion. When Christ needed His friends the most, they slept. In the end, in Matthew chapter 26, verse 56, skip down there just for a second. The very last part of the verse says, "Then all the disciples left Him and fled." So it's a place of desertion. They all left and they all fled. So there's a lot when you think about the garden, about what goes on, when you think about what Jesus had to endure and what He had to go through. But there is good in it. It is also an area of conquest. Gethsemane was not just an arena of conflict, an area of conflict. There's a lot more to the story. Gethsemane was not just negative. In the end, the Lord won one of His greatest victories. We can look at it as a place of supplications. Jesus went to the garden for one reason. He went there to pray. He had a place where He knew that He could go to be able to pray to God, to be able to sincerely talk one-on-one with God. So He had that place supplied for Him to be able to go there and pray. We were given insight here to why He prayed when we analyze the terms He used. In Mark chapter 14, He uses the words Abba, Father. And Abba is an Aramaic word meaning father, and the word Abba implies closeness, confidence, and connection. So it's not just somebody that you're talking to on the street, it's somebody that you have a close personal relationship with, as we know that that Jesus had with His Father. And not only did Jesus pray, but He encouraged His apostles to pray as well. Flip over to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 and verse 40. Back up to 39, it says, "And He came out and proceeded, as was His custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed Him. When He arrived at the place, He said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" So He Himself went there to pray, but He also asked His disciples to pray. So when we find that we are in our own Gethsemane, our own place like that, we need to make it a place of supplication. We need to find it being a place that we can do the right thing, that it's exactly what we need it to be there in that moment and what we can learn from that. And remember that no problem is so great that drawing near to God will not help. That's something that I've said up here, I know before, that I've taught in the teen class, that when we go away from negative things, from things that we know we shouldn't do, we shouldn't just turn away from those, but we need to run towards God. Every problem can be so much better when we turn towards God and when we draw nearer to God. It's also a place of submission. Just note the differences between prayers and the words as He continued. His prayers seem to get stronger here. They seem to get stronger in confidence. And by the time He had finished there on His third prayer, He could say with confidence to Peter, "The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" He asked the Father, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." But he understands and accepts that this is what He is going to do. This is what He came here to do, that this is the Father's plan, and He will fulfill it. So when the mobs come and arrest Jesus, it was not the ropes that kept Him from escaping, but it was the will of God. He knew it's what God wanted. He knew that it's what the plan was. And out of his love for each and every one of us, he saw that plan through. And it is also a place of strengthening. Turn with me real quick to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, which we read once. But in the days of his flesh he offered up both prayers and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. So Jesus' prayers were heard. They didn't fall on deaf ears. God was still with him. But when Jesus prayed to him, Jesus' prayers were heard. Luke 22:43 says that God sent an angel and to strengthen him, but God did not remove the cup that he had prayed for. God just provided enough strength to deal with the cup and to do what he needed to do. Now we can look at that in our lives today when we're going through a struggle or something. God will give us the strength we need. It may not be enough strength or just an easy way out, but he'll give us what we need so that we can learn from that, so that we can better ourselves and maybe even better those around us from what we may be going through. And then note his actions after he had been strengthened. In John 18:11, we are told that Jesus said, "The cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" There's a man by the name of John Gibson. He interpreted Jesus' statement here as he put forth his hand to take the cup from which he had been shrinking. So he reached out, he was willing to take the cup because he understood that's what needed done. And then back in Matthew chapter 26, verses 45 and 46, let's read them again. It says, "Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand.'" So he told his disciples, everything that we've gone through, everything that I've told you is going to happen, is happening now. It's time. It is starting right here and right now. And so from that moment on, Jesus was the only calm and composed person in the crowd, but instead of being the victim, Jesus was the victor. So in conclusion, again, think back to your own personal garden scene. What does it entail? Are they things that you can make it through? Are they things that with God strengthening us, that we can push through, that we can learn from, that we can get over and not have to go back into again? But know that Jesus has been through our garden and gives us an example of what to do. And that is pray, submit, and gain strength. That's not always easy. Praying, we know that we pray to God. Submitting, that takes some practice. But we know that we need to submit. We know that we are to do what God has commanded us to do and submit to his will and gain strength. Jason talked this morning about kids and the strength of they can go through so many things and come out happy. And sometimes as adults, it's really hard for us. But no matter what, we need to gain strength through whatever we're going through. And finally, one of the hardest tasks that any of us will ever face is getting our will in harmony with the will of God. But that's how Jesus won his victory, and that's how we will win ours. So it's just a great passage to study, looking at when Jesus was in the garden, and just understanding how we can apply that to our lives. So if you have a garden scene, if you have something that you're struggling with or that you have struggled with in the past, and maybe you're having trouble doing those three things, praying, submitting, and gaining strength, come talk to us. We want to pray for you. We want to pray with you. If it's something else that's on your mind or something else that you need prayers from the church, please make sure that you come and talk with one of us. Don't let it walk out the door with you, but please come while we stand and sing.